RealAg Live.
Hey, Kara Oosterhuis here with RealAgriculture.com. It is Monday. We are back with a RealAg Live, and I am excited to be here today. Very excited to have today's guest with me. As always, it's been a long year for many different reasons, but my guest and I here agree that we are ready to get back to seeing each other and back to things moving. So hopefully. But anyways, in the meantime, we're going to have another virtual conversation, and we are so excited to have you guys here today because it is just makes this being virtual a little less boring. So thank you very much. Today's guest here today is Marla Riekman, and she is with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. How is it going today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Kara?
I'm doing great. So we are here today to if I'm sure most people know who you are, but if they don't know who you are, you deal with soils. You are in my eyes, you're the go-to soils lady. So you want to tell us a bit about what you do?
Okay, like I said, I'm a soil management specialist. I guess I do everything related to soil and all the fun things that entails. So, as we'll probably end up talking about today, I deal with the problems in soil quite often. So, lots of things around compaction, salinity, all those kinds of issues, blowing soil, which we may get into today, dryness, that tillage. Basically, if it's soil management related, I get to deal with it. And I often will joke that as an extension specialist, half of my job is to deal with technical issues and talk about the technical stuff. And the other half is to, have somebody come and lie on my couch and tell me their problems, because quite often that's a big part of having these conversations with farmers and agronomists and talking through the issues. So it's challenging, but fun.
Absolutely. And I know as somebody who's, I'm in the southern part of the prairies, and if I'm going to lay on the couch and talk to you about some of my problems, I would say we are so dry right now. And we have had some wicked, wicked winds come through here. And it is just I have gotten some, fascinating photos, but not good to look at photos of just whole field blowing. If there's any sort of, I know often we can't do much, but is there anything that producers can be doing?
It's such a hard one because, again, you're dealing with it in the moment and you're trying to figure out how you're actually going to kind of get through this issue. There's one little tiny solution that sometimes works if you haven't seeded, or sometimes you'll see this after you've seeded the field, that it stops blowing a little bit or blows a little less. And that is a bit of tillage, actually. Tillage at the right time can actually slow or stop the blowing in the moment, just because you turn up some of that wet soil from below. But, and the big but is, if you don't get rain, you're drying out that surface again anyway. You're just causing additional issues. So sure, it's a short-term solution, but it's not necessarily going to be a long-term solution or something that's always going to have the biggest benefit. So it might stop it in the moment. But we do see sometimes people doing that, or if there's enough disturbance in their seeding operation, that may actually slow down some of that that blowing, just because it, again, turns up some of that wet soil a little bit.
Now, keeping to the dry front, we'll move to the other parts of the prairies after that. There is an excess of moisture, but in the drier parts of the prairies, we're looking right now at compaction. Does it make any difference going over the field if it's dry, or what's going on?
I guess it depends on where your dryness is. And so when we're dry at the surface, that's the issue we're talking about right now, whether or not we actually have enough moisture to get a crop going. But as long as we're not wet down below, if we're drier through that soil profile, compaction's not going to be an issue, because you can't compact a soil if it's actually got enough strength to withstand that pressure that's being put on it. It's when your soil is moist down below that pressure can actually allow those soil particles to kind of push against each other, and that allows that compaction to happen. So if it's dry, we're good, actually. We don't have to worry too much about compaction, which is something to be thankful for when it's dry, that at least there's one other problem we don't have to deal with. But if there's still moisture down below, then it still can be problematic.
So what sorts of things are you telling producers that, if they're coming to you from maybe more of a high moisture area when it comes to compaction, what are those things they're going to want to keep in mind?
Well, when you're dealing with a risky situation, so if you've got moisture, you've got something that's actually going to cause those big pores to collapse, you really want to focus on making sure that your tractor is performing optimally. So you want your tractor to be well ballasted. You want to make sure that if you are using tires, duals, you're spreading some of that pressure over a larger area, which means you need your tires to be appropriately inflated. And that's usually lower, quite a bit lower inflation than road speed inflation would be. So what that does is it kind of allows that tractor tire to stretch out widthwise as well as lengthwise. So now you're pressing that tire down over a larger area, and that decreases the overall pressure that's being put on the soil. If you're using tracks, you obviously aren't going to be changing that because it's just an automatic with your track. But again, the tracks versus tires debate, we talk about that all the time. If your duals are run at their rated pressure, they should be compacting no more than a track would. And then the other big thing really and maybe it's not such a huge issue at seeding time because our equipment isn't necessarily as heavy spread on that, like on those tracks. When we're talking about fall, I always bring up the grain cart because the grain carts getting bigger and bigger and heavier drive more of that compaction deep down. But the heavier your equipment, when you're running a full load with with the cart or with your seeder, and you got, you're full with fertilizer, everything, seed, there can be a lot of pressure pushing down on those tires that actually drives that compaction deeper into the soil than just the tires themselves do. So axle load is a key thing for people to keep in mind. And if you're in a high risk situation, you want to decrease that axle load as much as possible, knowing full well that it is not an easy thing to be able to just cut back on how full you run everything during, busy and stressful times of the year. But it is something to keep in mind. But I get not everybody wants to listen to the compaction talk when they've got a lot on the go and they don't want to have to bother thinking about how that compaction could affect them in the future.
Absolutely, but it can impact them in the future.
Yeah.
Like we don't necessarily always think, you think, oh, this is just another year. We're going to talk about compaction, but what sorts of long-term issues can that actually have?
It's one of those things that we unfortunately don't have a lot of hard data or solid kind of numbers to put to this. We know that there is a potential long-term effect to compaction. If we were talking about just surface compaction, just that surface track or tire compaction that's around the top 6 inches, you could say, well, I could deep till to try to break that up, or Mother Nature is going to wet and dry or freeze and thaw and break some of that up. And that might be true to a certain level. The problem is that deeper compaction that happens with the weight of the equipment, that axle load is so key because that deep drive of the compaction down into the soil profile is the thing that may never actually be relieved. There's been some really neat research where they've looked at that long-term compaction effect and found that some of that deeper effect, 10, 15 years down the road, does not come out. And so they were showing, comparing yield where you had no compaction to yield where they had deep compaction. There was about a 10% yield loss that was consistently seen years and years down the road because of that deep compaction. So when I say we got to watch out for axle load, I mean it because of the fact that that axle load compaction can be the thing that affects us for a very long time later on.
And although tire pressure might not be as important as that axle load, it's something that producers maybe can actually do. Like you said, we're really busy. Sometimes it's not
Mhm.
always the number one thing, but do you want to elaborate a bit more on soil on tire pressure and what maybe like taking a little bit of that air out of the tires could do for you long term?
Well, yeah. So I'm by no means an ag engineer. I will put this out there. This is not my area of expertise, and nor am I going to be your expert on, which tire needs to be inflated to what pressure for which piece of equipment that I'm hauling and pulling and all of that kind of stuff. That you want to talk to your tire experts about. You want to talk to those people because they're going to give you, and they've got the stats and the like the data on where you should be based on the equipment that you're pulling. The big thing, so we often will say whatever your tire pressure is at, there's kind of a rule of thumb that gets used that the actual pressure being placed on the soil is about 1 to 2 psi higher than the tire pressure itself. So say you're running 15 psi, so that means you're about 16, 17 psi potentially being pushed on the soil. The big thing about lowering that tire pressure again to its rated level is that when it stretches, it actually changes the shape of that tire. And so now the tire can function at its optimal kind of way, or in its optimal way. So you want those treads to actually connect with the soil. And one of the tricks that I will do is if you stop and you park the tractor in the yard somewhere on a piece of concrete. So if you've got concrete pads somewhere, you can actually check this by parking on that piece of concrete and seeing where the treads actually connect on that concrete, because a flat concrete pad is better than, a soft piece of ground or some gravel pad somewhere. And you can stick your finger underneath the edge of that tread. And if you can get a fingernail under there, actually get your finger kind of stuck underneath that edge, you're not inflated at a low enough amount. Like you're not allowing that tractor tire to actually connect the way it's supposed to. We've done some really neat images where we've parked the tractor with tires at different inflation amounts and on a piece of white cardboard, and then spray painted black paint around there. And so you can actually see how much of the tread was in contact with the tire. So when you're lowering that pressure, it's actually usually optimal for the tire. Again, it depends on the type of tire you're using and the kind of technology involved in that. So we have a lot of low inflation tire options now. There's even technologies for inflating on the go, which is a really cool thing, but expensive and not necessarily something that everybody wants to get into. But again, if compaction is something you're worried about, those are the kinds of conversations you might want to be having around, what kind of tire is really optimal for your typical soil conditions.
And from the sounds of it, it's not so much if compaction is something you're worried about, it's you should be worried about it, I think.
Yeah, and I think that people are starting to become more and more worried about it. That, or maybe people are trying to tell people to become more worried about it, because I keep getting invited to talk at things like this. So either people are already thinking about it, and I do get a lot more questions from people around, the how do we kind of adopt or adapt these ideas, but in the simplest form possible? Because again, these things can be really, really tricky. Again, the bare basics is make sure that you're running those tires at their inflated pressure. Again, if you've got tracks, you got tracks. It's fine. And then with those grain carts, be very, very cautious if you are in a wet situation in the fall. If it's dry, it's fine.
And yeah, we got all sorts of other issues if we're dry. Lindsay says, she puts in quotations, I play an ag engineer on TV, so she's picking up on your comment about maybe not being a professional technician, but
Yeah, I doctor on TV. Yes, definitely. That's what I play.
now Lara has a question here. She says, how does soil texture play into the compaction action?
First off, thank you for the compaction action comment, because that was good. Also, the soil texture is a good one too. So clay soils typically have a better ability to some degree to compress or compact. And that's because, for a couple of reasons, you would think, well, clay soils are often, when they have moisture, they can slide around a little bit more. And then they already have kind of those small pore spaces there. It's the big pore spaces that end up compacting in when that compaction action happens. It's the big pores that are crushed. And so in a clay soil, you can see that happen because, again, there's typically that water that's held in that clay means that it can smear a little bit easier. Then you have that crushing happen where you lose those big pores in that clay soil. And then you have the ultimate problem where now this clay soil really has no drainage left, because you can't move water through that soil in any speed at all, because the big pores that had been there that allowed that water to flow are long gone. And so clays can be super sensitive to this. We often see this too around things like the headlands, right? Areas where we're turning constantly around the fields, and you see areas where the ruts get worse, or it's when it's wet, you can see water ponding. It's all because the compaction is stopping the allowance for water to move down through that profile properly.
Lara she has her master's in soil science, so she is a fellow soil geek for sure, and that's where the compaction action comes from. So
Well, and I can also add too that, because I don't know, this question sometimes comes up every once in a while around, how do you do or can you do deep tillage to fix the problem? And in my, I don't know, 13 years now or so of dealing with this in my career with Manitoba Ag, or Agriculture and Resource Development, I should say, I have now, in the last couple of years, had the first time that I've ever recommended subsoiling to deal with a compaction issue. And the reason I recommended it, and it's actually, I think, looking pretty good in that spot, is because that soil is a sand. And that sand doesn't have the ability to crack and break open or shrink and swell the way that clays do, which actually allows for some natural alleviation of compaction. So this very fine sand has compacted very heavily and doesn't really have that natural ability to open back up, which is why we see things like a paratill and other kind of deep subsoil activity happening on potato fields or fields that are very sandy, because they do need to have that kind of that soil opened up a little bit, because there's very little natural alleviation of compaction when you've got those fine sands.
and Lindsay's saying, Marla stole my question. I don't know if that quite works this way, Lindsay. She's our guest. I don't think she can steal your questions, but thanks for coming out.
Are you wondering about asking about subsoiling, Lindsay? Because I know that that's probably what you're asking for.
There you
Yes.
go. And now Lindsay says, is there a situation that deep rippers and subsoilers make sense? So we're way ahead of you, Lindsay, but appreciate
Yeah, I'm jumping the gun again. That's the one time again that we actually see them sometimes make sense. Again, the reason being that the soils that I deal with in Manitoba typically have a fair bit of clay in them, and that clay content, the clays that we have the ability to shrink and swell. So in the Red River Valley, when I first moved to Manitoba for university, having grown up north of Saskatoon, people kept joking about like too much moisture. I didn't know that too much water was a thing ever. That didn't seem like it was possible from where I grew up. And then two, people would joke about, don't drop the wrench when you're working on the combine in the fall, because you'll lose it down a crack and never get it. And I'm like, what do you mean cracks that are 5 feet deep? Like, I've never seen this before. And then I've seen it. It happens. And that is Mother Nature subsoiling, essentially. It's opening up that soil. And when you get those conditions, there's no sense in trying to drag your own subsoiler through there, because that soil is opened up naturally on its own, which is great. We just need those dry conditions to cause that to happen.
we need the dry. Yeah.
I know. It's like there's such a push and pull when it comes. Yes, vertisols are crazy. Thank you, Laura. I saw that comment come up too. But this is the crazy thing. It's that push and pull between dry and wet, right? We want these perfect conditions, and the reality is, in a lot of cases, this shift between dry and wet is the cause and sometimes a solution to some of these problems naturally.
What sort of impacts does it have on the soil when you get, like we're quite dry, like you said, across the southern prairies, River Valley, it's dry. What happens when if all of a sudden, say tomorrow, you guys get a ton of rain? What sort of impacts does the downpour have on the soil?
The sad part is that depending on how quickly that happens or how dry the soil is to begin with, it doesn't necessarily mean that water is moving in. So if you get this heavy downpour, and we've seen this even last year, we saw that because we had very wet conditions last year, but when we would get these big, quick downpours, the soil doesn't have the capability to soak that up. If you think about on the news, when you hear of like mudslides and all of these crazy like torrential downpours and soil like moving and stuff like that, and I don't know, Mississippi, different like areas like that, it's usually in the middle of a drought that those extreme moisture events come and cause these massive like flows of water over land, and these kind of flood events, because a big heavy downpour is not going to soak up the soil. It's like it's too dry at the surface. It doesn't have the ability to kind of absorb that moisture if it comes down too fast. Then you get water flowing, you get sealing over that soil surface so that the soil particles kind of break up. There isn't any kind of the aggregates and all the particles and pieces of soil kind of break up into their individual bits. They kind of seal over the surface, and then you get a heavy or a big kind of drying couple of days, a lot of sunshine. You end up with a crust that's on top, which then causes even more problems for seedlings trying to get up out of the ground. And so it's we want some rain in many parts of the prairies, but we don't want a lot at once.
Yeah, I know. And then people, like, I feel like anyone outside of the egg industry is like, man, you farmers are sure whining a lot. Do you want rain or do you not? And it's like, well,
You
there's
want
a
it, but just
reason. Yeah, like, can we just like turn the tap on for a little bit? Yeah, that would be great.
yeah, a nice slow soaker rain for a little bit, and then it can go away, and then it can come back. Like, why can't it be perfect every year? Man, that would make life so much easier for us, eh?
Absolutely. So you do a lot with soil fertility too. Do
Mhm.
you want to talk in a drought? Is there anything that producers can be doing to kind of increase their soil fertility, or is there anything they need to be looking out for?
This is, I think, a topic that's coming up tonight. Am I not mistaken on
Yep, I had it just
the
on the
agronomist?
agronomist.
Yeah,
It'll
are
be
you
fine.
pitching for the agronomist tonight? Yeah, so I hear that my former master's professor, Don Flayton, is going to be joining. But just things you want to think about right now in dry conditions, and this might be something that we think about quite often in drier clay or drier conditions in Manitoba, and it goes everywhere else. You want to think about seed safety with seed starter fertilizer. So when you're putting any fertilizer down with the seed, especially if you're dealing with these drier conditions, the risk is a lot higher of having some kind of seedling damage. So you want to make sure that you're being cautious with that. In a lot of those cases, it may be a case where somebody like John Hurd would say, maybe this is a time when you want to think about splitting your fertilizer application, and seeing where this season takes you. So in a dry spring, and if you're concerned, if there's not a whole lot of moisture and the precipitation in the forecast, maybe going a bit more conservative on your nitrogen application if you're putting nitrogen down in the spring, because what it does is it gives you a chance to hedge your bets a little bit. And then later on, if the crop is doing well and you've got that moisture, you can do the top up application. You can get more of that nitrogen on then. But maybe rather than putting it all down right now and assuming that you're going to have a great year and potentially wasting a lot of nitrogen fertilizer if we don't have a great year, that could be something that you might want to be thinking about at this point in time.
Okay, but then I have to ask, and I know you know what I'm going to ask. If you're looking purely at the health of the soil, is it better to go over the field twice and put on
Good
that second top
question.
up, or is it better to like what's where are we at there?
Oh man, you know what? I this is a hard question, because again, every trip that you're doing over the field is at a different time of year with different potential conditions. If it's dry right now, if it's really dry enough, you're probably not doing a lot of impact down below. If you're truly dry right now, and that is a good point. But there's also the balancing act between, are we wasting a whole lot of nitrogen fertilizer because there's an environmental impact to putting down a whole bunch of nitrogen that's not going to get used either, right? So being able to think about where that impact is. The other thing too is depending on how you're getting that fertilizer down in the summer. If you are, floating it on something with, narrow, like with your sprayer, something like that, you might have it being applied over a wider area. So depending on what the size of your boom is, that type of thing, you might not be tracking the field as much as you're going across with your seeder in the spring. There's so many different variables. It gets really complicated. Sometimes I think that, it might get too complicated for us to worry about that a second effect potentially, just because we're trying to deal with the issue of the moment. But definitely a good question. And I mean, the same is true with every single trip that we do across the field.
Absolutely. And Lara's saying, "Oh, can we talk about the volatilization potential?" So you touched a bit on it, but do you want to elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah. So if we're talking volatilization, we want to think about what kind of fertilizer we're putting down. So if we're putting down ammonia-based fertilizers or something like urea that changes to ammonia pretty quick in the field, it converts pretty easily and pretty quickly. Then that's when you have that risk, especially if you are leaving it on the soil surface or leaving it near the soil surface. If you are banding your nitrogen fertilizer, you're fine. If you are broadcasting on nitrogen for like urea in the spring, you want to make sure that you're looking at protecting it somehow using some kind of urease inhibitor or something that can actually decrease or basically buys you a bit of time until the rain comes. Because you always want to put your urea down if you're broadcasting it, and then immediately get at least a quarter inch, if not a half inch of rain, a third to a half inch of rain, and that will help to melt the urea and kind of drive it or move it down into the soil. The worst thing that you can do is leave that urea on the surface of a damp soil or in moist conditions, because then that urea granule can dissolve because there's enough water for that, but it's not actually going to move into the soil, which means that it's at a really high risk of volatilization. So the surface applications, if you don't have rain coming in the next 24 to 36 hours or something right after application, you want to make sure that you're putting some kind of protection on it or you're getting it under the soil surface to begin with.
Absolutely. Now we're very quickly running out of time. It is always so much fun to chat with you, but I just wanted to ask one more quick question. Because I know you're a wealth of information. Is there anything you want to make sure you get out to producers this time of the year that they should have at top of mind?
I like I said, we've kind of talked a little bit about this idea of, how much we're trafficking over the field or thinking about these different things. I think the one thing I want people to think about a bit more at every trip across the field or every time you're in the tractor, like as you're spending time seeding and if you've got time with your thoughts, it's thinking about what type of steps could you take to try to decrease some of that impact on the soil, whether it's looking at some investments, whether into different tires, something like that, whether it's thinking in advance towards things like wet falls and how to deal with those conditions, how to have conversations with everybody who's working in the field. Fall is really when we start to focus. I know we're in spring right now, but fall is really when we start to think about our traffic because of the crisscrossing of all the equipment that's moving across a field. And we really need to think about being a bit more deliberate and traveling in the same area. So when we have time to think about it, when we have time and not thinking about it in the moment and having to make a panicked kind of last minute decision, it really makes making those changes a lot easier. And so, when you've got time to think about how can I decrease some of that overall footprint, like literal footprint on the soil, keep it in the back of your mind and think about how these changes can occur, and don't have to think about it as being an immediate thing. You can think about having these changes come on in a long term, like people who have adopted controlled traffic farming. It's not something you just want to up and decide you're going to do controlled traffic farming today, because then you have to buy a whole lot of equipment all in the multiples of 40 or whatever it is that you're working for with your equipment width. So these are things that take time, but with that time and with that thought can come a lot less impact down the road. And again, soil management things are long-term decisions. They're they're not, sometimes there's a fast impact to a decision like getting on the field and causing ruts everywhere because it's wet and we have to do it. But in terms of a lot of the things that we're talking about, they're long-term management decisions. They take time. It takes time as well to see the benefit. So don't think that I snap my fingers and I'm going to see everything kind of come up roses when it comes to the soil. But every little bit can count towards something that makes for a more sustainable soil management system.
Well, and as you said, some of these, yeah, they might not come until fall, but you're sitting on the tractor right now. It might be a good time to start thinking about it and, like you said, actually develop a plan because it all
Mm-hmm.
takes time. And I like to think of soil fitness as like our own fitness sometimes too. You can't just go to the gym once and be like, why am I not a supermodel?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to lose like weight just overnight. It doesn't work that way. You're not going to lose the weight of your grain cart overnight either. So
No, absolutely not. But as I said, we have run out of time. But thank you very much for your time, Marla. It is always great to have you on. And hopefully, we will be seeing you in a soil pit somewhere soon.
that's awesome. Thanks, Kara.
Yeah, you bet. And thanks everyone who tuned in today. As Marla noted earlier, tonight we are talking for our nutrients. The host Lindsay Smith will be on with you on The Agronomist at 6 p.m. Mountain or 8 p.m. Eastern. That is a great show. So be sure to tune in. Same way you found this one, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or by going www.realagriculture.com/live. And that'll get you to the live stream as well. So be sure to tune into that. And thanks everyone for joining. And in the meantime, thanks everyone for getting real and getting connected.